Have you ever wondered, what if I had made a different choice? Or felt that sinking feeling when you realize one decision can change everything? Well, today, I'm sharing a real story that will move you, full of twists, emotions, and a choice that could have cost it all. And by the end, you might just see things differently. Maybe even be inspired to take that leap you've been putting off. Before we start, comment where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. The scorching Texas sun bore down on Richard Dawson as he stood by the wooden fence of his ranch, arms crossed, his weathered face hardened with resolve. His ranch, Dawson Cattle Company, had been in his family for 3 generations, and he had always prided himself on making tough, practical decisions. Raising cattle and horses wasn't just a livelihood. It was a battle against unpredictable markets, droughts, and rising costs. And now, another harsh decision lay before him. Daisy, his once prized mare, stood a few yards away in the pasture, her golden coat dulled by sickness, her legs trembling under the weight of her own body. She had been with them for years, a gift to his wife Emily on their 10th wedding anniversary. She had been strong, fast, a beauty in her prime. But time and illness had stripped her down, leaving her frail and weak. The vet had confirmed it, degenerative joint disease. There was no cure, only slow deterioration. Richard took off his Stetson, ran a calloused hand through his graying hair, and sighed. I can't keep sinking money into a horse that's just going to get worse. His voice was low, filled with the exhaustion of years spent making decisions no one else wanted to make. Across from him, Emily stood rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. Her auburn hair, streaked with strands of silver, framed a face lined with the marks of years under the sun, but her hazel eyes burned with defiance. She had spent countless mornings in the stable with Daisy, brushing her mane, whispering to her, feeding her apples from the old tree in their yard. The idea of abandoning her was unthinkable. You don't just throw her away, Richard, Emily said, her voice sharp with anger. She's family. Richard shook his head, jaw tightening. Family, he scoffed. She's a horse, and she's sick. You know what that means out here. She's got no use to us anymore. Emily took a step forward, closing the space between them. She was never just a use to me. She's been with us for over a decade. You can't just turn your back on her, because she's not convenient anymore. Richard exhaled sharply, looking away toward the herd of cattle grazing in the distance. It's not about convenience. It's about reality. Vet bills are expensive, and we've already spent enough. The ranch comes first. Always. Emily's hands balled into fists. This ranch is all you care about, isn't it? Not the animals. Not me. Just the goddamn business. Richard's patience frayed. You think this is easy for me? You think I want to do this? Jesus, Emily, I don't have a choice. We can't afford to waste money on a horse that's only going to suffer. Emily's voice broke, her frustration turning into raw emotion. So you're just going to leave her out in the wild to die? That's your solution? Richard's eyes hardened. She won't make it much longer anyway. I'll take her out past the property line, near the old canyon. She'll have a few days, maybe a week. It's better than putting her down right away. Emily stared at him, disbelief washing over her features. So you'd rather let her starve out there? Alone? That's your mercy. Richard swallowed, his throat tight. At least this way, I won't have to be the one to pull the trigger. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The distant sound of cattle lowing and the wind rustling through the dry grass were the only noises that filled the space between their anger and heartbreak. Finally, Emily shook her head, her voice trembling. You weren't always like this. There was a time you actually had a heart, Richard. Her words hit deeper than she knew, but he refused to show it. Instead, he turned away, walking toward the truck, slamming the door shut before she could say another word. The engine roared to life, and within minutes, he was gone, leaving behind a trail of dust and a wife who no longer recognized the man she had married. Daisy, standing weakly in the field, lifted her head toward Emily, her ears twitching as if sensing the turmoil in the air. Emily walked over, her chest tight with grief. I won't let him do this to you, she whispered, running a gentle hand down Daisy's neck. The mare leaned into her touch, her breathing labored but steady. A fire lit inside Emily's heart. If Richard wouldn't do what was right, she would. She wasn't going to let Daisy die alone. She just had to figure out how to save her, without Richard finding out. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Richard's steady breathing beside her felt like a reminder of how far apart they had grown. She turned her head slightly, studying his face, creased with stress, hardened by years of labor, the same man she had once loved so fiercely. But now he was willing to abandon Daisy like she was nothing. The anger in her chest burned hot. She had always known Richard to be practical, even ruthless when it came to the ranch. But this was beyond cruel. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake him, and slipped out of bed. The wooden floors of their ranch house creaked under her bare feet as she made her way to the living room. The house was old, built by Richard's grandfather, filled with worn furniture and pictures of the life they had built together. A life she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. She pulled on a jacket and stepped outside onto the porch, the crisp Texas night air biting at her skin. The moon cast a pale glow over the ranch, and in the distance, she saw the faint outline of the pasture where Daisy stood, alone and unaware of her fate. "I won't let him do this to you," she whispered under her breath. She had made up her mind. She was going to save Daisy. The call for help Emily wasn't a vet. She had no idea how to care for a horse with a degenerative disease, but she knew someone who did. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name, Dr. Michael Hayes. Michael had been a close friend for years. He had started as the ranch's veterinarian, but over time, he had become a confidant, one of the few people she trusted. She hesitated for only a moment before hitting dial. The phone rang twice before his voice came through, groggy but alert. "Emily? It's almost midnight. Is everything okay?" She took a deep breath. "No, Michael. It's not." A pause. "Then what happened?" Emily swallowed hard. "It's Daisy. Richard. He's planning to take her out past the canyon and leave her there to die." Michael cursed under his breath. "Jesus Christ. I can't believe him." "I can," she said bitterly. "But I'm not letting it happen. I need your help." There was another pause, but Emily knew Michael well enough to hear the shift in his tone. He was already thinking of solutions. "All right," he said finally. "Tell me what you need." Emily exhaled, the tension in her chest loosening just a little. "I need a place to keep her, somewhere Richard won't find out. And I need help figuring out how to take care of her." Michael was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's an old barn behind my clinic. It's not much, but it's safe. No one would look for her there." Hope flared in Emily's heart. "That's perfect. When do you want to do this?" Michael asked. She looked back toward the house, her eyes dark with determination. "Tonight." The rescue the next few hours felt like a blur. Emily moved quietly, gathering supplies, feed, blankets, a rope. Every movement was calculated, her heart hammering in her chest as she glanced nervously toward the bedroom, making sure Richard was still asleep. Finally, she crept outside, her boots crunching against the dirt as she hurried toward the pasture. Daisy stood in the moonlight, ears flicking as Emily approached. The mare let out a soft exhale, recognizing her immediately. Emily reached out, stroking her neck. "Hey girl, we're getting out of here." Michael arrived a few minutes later in his truck, the trailer hitched to the back. He climbed out, his tall frame tense with urgency. "You sure about this?" Emily nodded. 100%. Michael sighed. "All right, let's move fast." Getting Daisy into the trailer was difficult. The mare was weak, but she resisted, as if sensing the danger of being moved in the dead of night. Emily whispered softly, soothing her, promising her safety. After what felt like an eternity, Daisy stepped up into the trailer, her body trembling. Emily exhaled in relief, but the moment was short-lived. From the ranch house, a light flicked on. Her stomach dropped. "Shit," Michael muttered. Emily froze, her pulse pounding. Had Richard heard them? For a long moment, the light stayed on, but no door opened. No footsteps came. Finally, the light flicked off. Emily released the breath she had been holding. Michael looked at her. "That was close. Too close," she whispered. They didn't waste any more time. Michael climbed into the driver's seat, and Emily slid into the passenger side. The truck rumbled to life, and within minutes, they were on the road, leaving Dawson Ranch behind. As the ranch disappeared in the rearview mirror, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. But underneath it, another feeling stirred, fear. She had gone behind Richard's back, lied to him, stolen from him, and when he found out, she had no idea what he would do. The road stretched out before them, dark and empty under the vast Texas sky. Emily kept her eyes on the side mirror, half expecting to see Richard's truck barreling down behind them. But the road remained clear. Beside her, Michael gripped the wheel, his jaw tight. You know he's going to find out, right? Emily let out a shaky breath. Yeah, but by the time he does, Daisy will already be safe. Michael shook his head. Emily, this isn't just about a horse. You lied to him. You went behind his back. That's not something a man like Richard is going to take lightly. Emily turned to him, eyes flashing. And what would you have done, Michael? Let him abandon her to die out there? Michael sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. No, of course not. But I also don't want to see you get hurt in the process. Emily looked away, staring out the window. She knew Michael was right. Richard wasn't the type to let something like this go. He was stubborn, proud, and unwilling to be defied. But she had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. The hidden sanctuary, the drive to Michael's clinic, took almost an hour. The town of Colton Ridge was small, its streets quiet at this late hour. Michael's veterinary practice sat on the outskirts, surrounded by rolling fields and an old barn that hadn't been used in years. As they pulled into the driveway, Emily's eyes flickered to the barn. It was weathered but sturdy, its red paint faded from years of sun exposure. This would be Daisy's home, for now. Michael cut the engine and turned to Emily. Let's get her inside before she gets too stiff from the ride. They moved quickly, opening the trailer and carefully guiding Daisy down the ramp. The mare's legs trembled, and for a moment, Emily thought she might collapse. Michael murmured softly, stepping forward to steady her. Easy, girl. I got you. With slow, careful steps, Daisy let them lead her into the barn. The smell of old hay and wood filled the space, and Emily could almost feel the years of history here. Michael had cleared out a stall, laying down fresh bedding. As soon as they got Daisy settled, Emily ran a hand down her neck, her heart twisting at how thin she had become. Michael grabbed his medical bag. I need to check her over. Emily stepped aside, watching as Michael examined Daisy's legs, pressed gently along her spine, and checked her breathing. He didn't speak at first, which made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Finally, he exhaled. She's weaker than I thought. The joint disease has progressed. It's painful, Em. She's been pushing through, but she's hurting. Emily swallowed hard. Can you help her? Michael met her gaze. I can manage the pain, but this isn't a fixable condition. Even with medication, there's no guarantee she'll improve. Emily's hands balled into fists. I don't care about guarantees. I just need her to have a chance. Michael studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right, I'll do everything I can. Relief flooded through Emily, but it was short-lived, because now, the real fight was just beginning. The cost of saving a life. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the fields. Emily leaned against the stall, exhaustion weighing heavy on her bones. Michael joined her, arms crossed. You're going to need supplies. Anti-inflammatory meds, supplements, proper feed. It's not going to be cheap. Emily sighed. I figured. Michael hesitated before asking, do you have access to any of the ranch funds? Emily let out a bitter laugh. You think Richard lets me touch the money? No. He controls everything. Every dollar that comes in and out of that place. Michael frowned. Then how are you planning to pay for this? Emily hesitated. She had some savings, tucked away from years of stretching every penny Richard gave her. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I'll figure something out, she said, though she had no idea how. Michael ran a hand through his hair, clearly uneasy. Emily, I want to help, but I need to be honest with you. This is going to put a strain on you. Physically, emotionally, financially. Are you sure you're ready for that? Emily turned to him, fire in her eyes. I'd rather struggle every damn day than sit back and watch her die. Michael sighed. All right, then let's get to work. A storm brewing at home, Emily stayed with Daisy for as long as she could, brushing her coat, whispering soft reassurances. She could already see a slight difference. Daisy seemed calmer, as if sensing she was safe. But Emily couldn't stay forever. She had to go back. She climbed into her truck, gripping the wheel tightly. The drive back to the ranch felt longer, heavier. By the time she pulled up to the house, her stomach was in knots. She stepped inside quietly, but she didn't have to look far. Richard was waiting for her. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The cold morning light cast sharp shadows across his face, making his sharp features seem even harder. Emily braced herself. Where the hell were you? He asked, his voice dangerously low. Emily swallowed, keeping her face neutral. I went into town. Richard's eyes narrowed. In the middle of the goddamn night? Her pulse pounded in her ears. I couldn't sleep. Richard took a step closer. So you just up and left? Didn't think to wake me? Didn't think I'd notice? Emily's heart thundered in her chest. He knows. I don't have to tell you my every move, Richard. Richard stared at her, his gaze sharp and calculating. You did something, didn't you? She held her ground. I don't know what you're talking about. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. You always were a terrible liar, Emily. Silence hung heavy between them. Then, Richard's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. If I find out you went behind my back, if I find out you stole from me to save that damn horse. Emily cut him off, her voice steel. And what, Richard? What will you do? For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, with years of resentment. Finally, Richard shook his head, stepping back. You better pray you didn't, Emily. Then he turned and walked out the door. Emily sucked in a breath, her hands shaking. He didn't know. Not yet. But he would. And when that day came, she had to be ready. The tension in the house was suffocating. Emily could feel it in every meal eaten in silence, in the way Richard barely spoke to her unless it was about the ranch. Even then, his words were clipped, laced with suspicion. She had done her best to keep her routine normal, to avoid raising further doubts. But every morning when Richard left for the fields, she found herself checking the window, waiting for his truck to disappear down the dirt road before rushing to her own vehicle. She had to get to Daisy. The hidden struggle at Michael's barn. Daisy was hanging on, but Emily could see how fragile she still was. Her movements were slow, stiff, each step a struggle. The medication helped ease her pain, but Emily knew it was only buying time. Michael leaned against the stall, arms crossed, exhaustion written on his face. She's improving, but it's slow, and we're running out of the anti-inflammatory meds. Emily felt her stomach drop. How much more do we have? She asked. Michael sighed. Maybe a few more days' worth. After that, we need to get more, or she's going to be in pain again. Emily clenched her fists. The medication wasn't cheap, and her small stash of money was dwindling fast. She had been sneaking out small amounts of cash from the ranch's grocery fund, but it wouldn't be enough for long. Michael saw the hesitation in her face. I know that look, he said. What are you thinking? Emily hesitated before whispering. There's a livestock supply store in town. They keep a backstock of meds. If I can get in there while Richard's busy. Michael's brow furrowed. Emily, stealing from a store? That's not the answer. I wouldn't steal, she shot back. I'd pay. I just need to find a way to take the cash from Richard without him noticing. Michael sighed. You're playing a dangerous game. He's already suspicious. Emily nodded. I know. And she knew it was only a matter of time before Richard started looking for answers. The storm brewing at home that afternoon. Emily was back at the ranch, stirring a pot of stew when she heard the sound of Richard's boots against the hardwood floor. She didn't turn around. Went into town today, he said casually. Emily's hands stilled on the spoon. Oh, she asked, keeping her voice light. Richard leaned against the doorway. Ran into someone at the feed store. Emily's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral as she turned to face him. Yeah. Richard's eyes stayed locked on hers. They said they saw you at Michael's clinic. The room felt smaller. Emily forced a small shrug. I was visiting. You know Michael's a friend. Richard tilted his head slightly, studying her. You don't usually go see him that often. Emily held her ground. Maybe I needed someone to talk to. Richard let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Funny. You never needed a damn vet to talk to before. Silence stretched between them. Emily's palms were sweating, but she refused to back down. Richard sighed, shaking his head. I know something's going on, Emily. I can feel it, and I'm going to find out what it is. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Emily gripping the counter, her breath uneven. He was getting closer to the truth, and she was running out of time. The desperate gamble that night, Emily made her decision. She waited until Richard was asleep, his heavy breathing filling the room. Then, moving silently, she slipped out of bed and crept to the office. Richard kept cash in a locked drawer, a stash he used for ranch expenses. He never counted it down to the dollar, so she just needed to take a little, just enough to buy more medication. She held her breath as she knelt beside the desk. The drawer was locked, but she had seen him open it enough times to know where he kept the key. Her fingers shook as she turned the lock. The drawer slid open. Inside, a neat stack of bills rested on top of an old ledger, a hunting knife, and a few scattered papers. Emily's hands trembled as she pulled out a few 20s, careful to keep the stack looking untouched. She shut the drawer, locked it, and placed the key back exactly where she had found it. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she tiptoed back to bed, slipping under the covers beside Richard. He didn't stir, but Emily couldn't sleep. She had just stolen from her own husband, and she had no idea how much longer she could keep the truth from him. A dangerous clue. The next morning, Emily was feeding the chickens when she heard Richard shouting from inside the house. Her blood went cold. She wiped her hands on her jeans and hurried inside, her heart pounding. Richard was standing by his desk, the drawer wide open, his face twisted in fury. "Emily," he barked. She forced her expression into one of confusion. "What's wrong?" Richard slammed the drawer shut. "Someone's been in my goddamn office." Emily swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" His eyes narrowed. "Money's missing. Not much, but enough." Emily's hands clenched into fists to keep them from shaking. "Maybe you miscounted?" she suggested. Richard stepped toward her, his voice low. "I don't make mistakes like that, Emily." She forced herself to hold his gaze. "Well, it wasn't me." Richard studied her, his dark eyes searching for a crack in her lie. Then, he nodded slowly, his expression turning to something even colder. "All right," he said. "If it wasn't you, then I guess I'll start looking elsewhere." Emily felt her breath catch. She knew what he meant. Richard wasn't going to let this go. And if he started looking for the truth, he would find Daisy. Emily didn't breathe until Richard was gone. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the office door, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Richard was already on the hunt, and if he found Daisy, everything would come crashing down. She had to act fast. A desperate visit that afternoon, when Richard was busy out on the ranch, Emily rushed back to Michael's clinic. The moment she stepped inside, Michael saw the tension in her face. "What happened?" he asked. Emily shut the door behind her. "Richard knows something is off. He noticed the missing money." Michael let out a long sigh, rubbing his face. "Damn it, Emily. I didn't have a choice," she snapped. "I needed the medication." Michael's expression softened. "I know, but this is getting dangerous." Emily ran a shaking hand through her hair. "We need to speed this up. Daisy has to get stronger, fast. If Richard starts looking around, he'll find her." Michael exhaled. "All right, we'll adjust her meds, increase physical therapy. But even if she improves, what's your plan? You can't keep her hidden forever." Emily hesitated. She had been so focused on keeping Daisy alive that she hadn't thought about what came next. "I'll figure it out," she said finally. Michael didn't look convinced. Signs of progress. Emily spent the next few hours with Daisy, helping Michael gently walk her around the barn, monitoring her breathing, her weight, her energy. And for the first time since all this started, Emily saw hope. Daisy was still weak, but her steps were steadier, her eyes brighter. Emily brushed her coat, whispering softly, "You're a fighter, girl. We're going to get through this." The mare nuzzled her hand, and Emily felt something inside her tighten with emotion. She wouldn't let Richard win. Richard's growing suspicion that night. Emily was preparing dinner when she heard Richard's truck pull into the driveway. Her body tensed. A moment later, the front door slammed shut, and Richard strode into the house, his boots tracking dirt across the floor. Emily didn't turn around. "Where were you today?" Richard asked. She kept stirring the soup. "Running errands." "What?" Richard leaned against the counter, watching her. "You're lying." Emily's grip on the spoon tightened. "I'm not lying." "Bullshit," Richard said, his voice cold. "I went by Michael's clinic today." Emily's blood turned to ice. She forced herself to stay calm. "And he was acting strange," Richard said, studying her. "Like he was hiding something." Emily forced a laugh. "Michael's always been weird. You know that." Richard didn't laugh. "Maybe. Or maybe he knows where my money went." Emily kept her face neutral, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. Richard stepped closer. "Tell me the truth, Emily. What the hell are you up to?" Emily met his gaze, forcing steel into her voice. "You don't get to interrogate me, Richard." His jaw clenched. "You're my wife. I have every right to know what you're doing behind my back." Emily's anger flared. "Your wife? That hasn't meant anything to you in years." For a moment, Richard looked genuinely taken aback. But then, his expression darkened. I don't have time for games, Emily. If you're hiding something from me, I'll find out. And you won't like what happens when I do. He turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing in the kitchen, her heart pounding. She had bought herself a little more time. But she knew Richard wasn't going to stop until he had the truth. A dangerous decision late that night. Emily sat in bed, staring at the ceiling. She had one option left. Daisy couldn't stay here. She had to get her somewhere far away, somewhere Richard would never find her. And there was only one place that made sense. Her brother, Ben, had a ranch in Montana. He had the land, the resources, and most importantly, he hated Richard just as much as she did. Emily grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she typed out a message. Ben, I need your help. It's about Daisy. Can you take her? She hesitated, then hit send. A minute later, her phone buzzed. Of course. When? Emily exhaled. It was time to get Daisy out of Texas. Emily lay awake long after sending the message to Ben, staring at the ceiling as 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Getting Daisy to Montana wouldn't be easy. It was over a 1,500-mile journey, and she'd have to do it without Richard suspecting a thing. She couldn't afford any mistakes. She turned onto her side, glancing at Richard's sleeping form. His breathing was heavy, his back turned toward her, a silent reminder of the growing chasm between them. This wasn't just about saving Daisy anymore. It was about saving herself, too. The first move the next morning, Emily headed straight to Michael's clinic. She walked in, closing the door behind her, and immediately whispered, "We need to get Daisy out of here." Michael looked up from his desk, his expression turning serious. "What happened?" Emily ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply. "Richard's getting too close. He went by the clinic yesterday. He knows something's off. If we don't move her now, he'll find her." Michael sighed, rubbing his jaw. "And where exactly do you plan on taking her?" "Montana. My brother Ben has a ranch there. He can take her in." Michael's eyebrows shot up. "Montana? That's a hell of a trip, Emily." "I know," she admitted. "But it's the only place Richard won't look." Michael leaned back in his chair, considering. "You'll need a trailer. A good one. That's a long ride for a horse in her condition." Emily nodded. "I can borrow one from Ben. He knows someone making a delivery run from Dallas up to Colorado. If we can get Daisy that far, Ben can meet them and take her the rest of the way." Michael let out a low whistle. "That's still risky. Richard's no idiot. If he figures out she's gone, he'll come looking." Emily clenched her fists. "Then we have to make sure he doesn't." A dangerous distraction. Emily knew that the only way to get Daisy out unnoticed was to keep Richard busy, and she knew exactly how to do it. That evening, she waited until Richard was out in the stables, tending to the cattle. Then, she walked outside, her heart pounding as she approached. Richard glanced up, his expression wary. "What do you want?" Emily forced herself to smile, crossing her arms. "You've been suspicious of me lately." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Because you're hiding something." She shrugged. "Or maybe you just stopped trusting me a long time ago." He didn't say anything, just kept watching her. Emily took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. "I know things haven't been great between us. Maybe we should take a day off. Just us. No ranch work. No fighting." Richard frowned. "You serious?" "Yeah." She tucked her hair behind her ear. "When's the last time we spent time together?" "Just us." Richard hesitated, then let out a sigh. "Hell, I don't know." Emily smiled slightly. "Then let's fix that. Tomorrow, let's take the truck out to the lake. We can fish, drink beer, like we used to." Richard studied her for a long moment. "And what's in it for you?" "Maybe I just miss my husband," she lied. Richard's eyes softened just a little. Finally, he nodded. "All right. Tomorrow, we go to the lake." Emily forced herself to hold the smile. Because tomorrow, while Richard was at the lake, Daisy would be on the road to freedom. The escape begins the next morning. Emily packed a cooler, pretending to be excited for the day ahead. Richard seemed almost relaxed for the first time in weeks, believing her act completely. She had one shot at this. Michael had arranged for a transport driver, one of his old colleagues, to pick up Daisy that morning. They had a small window of time to get her loaded into the trailer and on the road. As Emily climbed into the truck beside Richard, her stomach twisted with nerves. She kept her phone in her lap, waiting for Michael's text. Finally, it came. "She's loaded. We're on the road." Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Daisy was safe. Now, she just had to make sure Richard never found out. Richard's discovery the day at the lake was almost unbearable. Emily laughed when she needed to, pretended to enjoy the quiet afternoon, all while her mind was back in Texas, praying the plan was working. By the time they got home, the sun was setting, and Emily felt a moment of relief. They had pulled it off. But then, Richard suddenly stopped in his tracks. Emily turned to see him staring toward the back pasture. His eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. Richard strode toward the fence, scanning the land. Then he froze. Daisy was gone. Emily's stomach dropped. She barely had time to react before Richard turned on her, his face dark with fury. "Where is she?" he demanded. Emily forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know." Richard stepped closer, his eyes burning into hers. "Don't lie to me, Emily. Where the hell is my horse?" Emily held his gaze, her heart pounding. "She's not your horse anymore, Richard." The air between them crackled with tension. Richard's jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. For the first time in years, Emily wasn't afraid of him. "You let her go," Richard growled. Emily lifted her chin. "I saved her." Richard exhaled sharply, stepping back. His hands went to his hips, his head tilting toward the sky as he let out a bitter laugh. Then, his eyes cut back to her, sharp and filled with something dangerous. "You think this is over?" he said, voice low. "You think you won?" Emily's blood ran cold. Richard turned and stormed toward his truck. He was going after Daisy, and Emily had no idea how far he'd go to bring her back. Emily could barely breathe as she watched Richard storm toward his truck. She had known he would be angry, but this was something else. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter, his hands curling into fists as he yanked open the driver's side door. Emily snapped into action. She ran after him, her boots kicking up dirt. "Richard, stop!" she shouted. He spun around so fast, she almost crashed into him. "Stop!" His voice was low, dangerous. "You expect me to just let this go?" Emily swallowed hard. "She's gone, Richard. Just let her go." His nostrils flared. "Where did you send her?" Emily's pulse pounded. She had to stall him, to buy Daisy more time. "I'm not telling you that." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "That's cute, Emily. Real cute. But I'll find her. And when I do, you're going to regret this." He turned back to the truck. Panic surged in Emily's chest. She grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "You can't do this, Richard." He jerked free, stepping closer, towering over her. "Watch me." Emily stared at him, heart racing. She had never been more afraid of him than she was in that moment. Because Richard wasn't just angry. He was on a warpath. He climbed into the truck, slamming the door, and the engine roared to life. Emily ran toward the driver's side window, slapping her hands against the glass. "You don't have to do this." Richard's cold eyes met hers through the window. Then, without another word, he hit the gas. The truck kicked up a cloud of dust, tires spinning as he tore down the driveway. Emily stood frozen, watching the taillights disappear into the night. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Richard was going after Daisy, and she had no idea how far he was willing to go to get her back. A race against time. Emily didn't waste a second. She bolted inside the house, grabbing her phone with shaking hands. She dialed Ben's number. It rang once, twice. Then, finally, he answered. "Emily." Ben's voice was groggy. He had probably been asleep. "What's wrong?" Emily pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady herself. "Richard knows. He's coming after Daisy." Silence. Then, Ben swore under his breath. "Damn it. How much of a head start does he have?" Emily checked the clock. "Maybe 5 minutes. But you know him. Ben, he won't stop." Ben was silent for a moment. Then his voice hardened. "Don't worry. I'll make sure he doesn't get near her." Emily exhaled, but the relief was short-lived. Because she knew Richard, and he was a man who didn't take losing lightly. The road to trouble Richard's truck tore down the highway, headlights cutting through the dark Texas night. His hands gripped the steering wheel like a vice, his mind racing. Emily thought she had outplayed him. She thought she could just take his horse and walk away. She was dead wrong. He had a good idea of where Daisy was going. Emily had only ever trusted 2 people in this world, Michael and her brother, Ben. And Ben? He was in Montana, which meant Daisy was headed north. Richard grabbed his phone, dialing a number. A gruff voice answered. "Yeah. Paul, it's Richard. I need a favor." Paul was a livestock hauler Richard had known for years, a man who knew every trucker and transport route in the state. "What kind of favor?" Paul asked. Richard's voice was like steel. I need to find a horse. Tonight. Paul let out a low whistle. That's a tall order. Got any leads? Richard's jaw clenched. I know she's on the road, headed north. Probably in a trailer, maybe linked to a veterinary clinic. Paul was silent for a moment. Then, let me make a few calls. Richard nodded. Do it. And if you find her. He leaned forward, voice cold as ice. You call me first. No one else. Emily's last hope back at the ranch. Emily paced the kitchen, her stomach in knots. Her phone buzzed. Ben. She snatched it up. Did you find out anything? Ben's voice was tight. The driver just called me. He thinks someone's tailing him. Emily's blood ran cold. Richard? Not sure yet. But it's someone asking questions. And if it's not Richard, it's one of his guys. Emily's hands shook. Damn it. Ben took a breath. Listen, Em. We might have to change plans. If Richard catches up to them before they cross state lines, he could try to claim Daisy as stolen property. Emily's heart pounded. What do we do? Ben's voice hardened. We get her somewhere safe. Now. The final play. Emily hung up the phone and immediately dialed Michael. He answered on the first ring. Emily? What's going on? Emily pressed a hand to her forehead, breathing fast. Richard's tracking Daisy. We need to reroute her now. Michael didn't hesitate. Okay. There's a place about an hour north of here. A small farm owned by a friend of mine. She does equine rehab. No one would think to look there. Emily nodded quickly. Can you set it up? Already on it, Michael said. I'll call the driver and tell him to take the detour. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, then whispered, Thank you. Michael's voice softened. I won't let him take her, Emily. I promise. Emily exhaled shakily. Now, all they could do was hope they got to Daisy before Richard did. Because if Richard caught up first, Emily didn't even want to think about what he'd do. The highway stretched ahead, long and dark, the only sounds the hum of tires on asphalt. In the front seat of the transport truck, Joe Walker, a seasoned hauler, gripped the wheel tighter than usual. Something wasn't right. His cargo, a thin, golden mare, was in the trailer behind him, her soft, labored breathing barely audible over the road noise. But what made his pulse quicken was the set of headlights in his rearview mirror that hadn't left for the last 10 miles. Someone was tailing him. The call that changed everything. Joe's phone buzzed against the dashboard. He grabbed it, glancing at the name, Michael Hayes. Good. About damn time. Joe answered, keeping his eyes on the road. Tell me you've got a new plan, Doc, 'cause I got a tail and I don't like it. Michael's voice was tense. We know. Change of plans. You're not taking her to Colorado anymore. Joe cursed under his breath. Where the hell am I going then? Farm an hour north. Private. Safe. No one will look there. Joe glanced at the mirror again. The headlights were still there. Whoever was following him wasn't backing off. Send me the damn address, he muttered. A second later, his phone pinged with a new location. He clenched his jaw. All right, but if this guy back here decides to make a move, things are gonna get ugly. Michael's voice was dead serious. Just get Daisy there safe, Joe. Whatever it takes. Joe hung up and flicked on his turn signal, veering off onto a quieter road. Let's see if you're really following me, asshole. Richard closes in a few miles back. Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel, watching as the transport truck took an unexpected turn. His gut twisted with frustration. He had gotten the confirmation from Paul. A vet hauler was moving a horse matching Daisy's description out of Texas. And now, here he was, following the damn trailer with no way of knowing for sure if Daisy was inside. He hit the gas, closing the distance. Then his phone rang. Paul. Richard answered, eyes still locked on the truck ahead. Talk. Got a name on the driver, Paul said. Joe Walker. Used to run cattle hauls. Now he does private horse transport. He's tight with that vet of yours, Michael. Richard's eyes darkened. Michael. Of course. He should have known Emily couldn't have pulled this off alone. Where's he headed? Richard demanded. Paul hesitated. That's the thing. He was supposed to go to Colorado. But now, looks like he's going off-route. Richard's pulse spiked. They were onto him. His jaw tightened. I need to stop that truck. Paul's voice was cautious. Richard, you try anything reckless, and you'll be dealing with a stolen livestock charge. Richard gritted his teeth. He didn't give a damn about charges. He just wanted his horse back. Emily's last stand back at the ranch. Emily sat in the dark, her hands curled around a mug of cold coffee. Her phone lay on the table, silent, and the longer it stayed that way, the worse the knot in her stomach became. She had done everything she could. Now, it was out of her hands. Then, finally, her phone buzzed. She snatched it up. Ben. She pressed it to her ear, heart racing. Tell me she's safe. Ben's voice was clipped, urgent. We've got a problem. Emily's breath caught. What? Richard's on their tail. Her world tilted. No. He's following the hauler. If Joe doesn't lose him, Richard's gonna catch up before they reach the new drop-off. Emily stood so fast her chair nearly toppled over. We have to stop him. Ben's voice hardened. There's only one way to do that. Emily already knew what he meant. She had to confront Richard. Head-on collision on the highway, Joe was running out of options. Richard wasn't backing off. Every turn, every detour, the truck was still there, riding his bumper. Joe muttered a curse. You want to play rough, cowboy? Let's see how good you are. He suddenly slammed the brakes. Richard barely had time to react. Tires screeched. His truck fishtailed. Joe hit the gas again, swinging his trailer onto a dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust so thick it blinded the rearview mirror. For a second, just a second, Richard disappeared from sight. Joe took the chance. He gunned it. Emily's gamble. Emily's truck flew down the road, her hands gripping the wheel so tight her knuckles ached. She knew exactly where Richard was heading, and she was going to get there first. Ben's voice rang through the speakerphone. Are you sure about this, Em? Emily's voice was steel. Yes. She saw the headlights in the distance, Richard's truck barreling toward her. Emily didn't slow down. She slammed on the horn. Richard saw her at the last second. His truck skidded to a stop just inches from hers, the engines growling in the silent night. Emily jumped out, marching toward him. Richard flung his door open, fury radiating off him. Get out of my damn way, Emily. Emily planted herself between his truck and the road ahead. No. His nostrils flared. She's my horse. No, Richard. Her voice was steady. She's mine now. Richard stepped forward, his voice dropping low. You think you can stop me? Emily's heart pounded, but she held firm. You lay one hand on Daisy, and I swear, I will call the sheriff myself. Richard froze. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling. Finally, he let out a slow, sharp breath. You really think you won, don't you? Emily's voice was soft but firm. I didn't win, Richard. I just stopped losing. He stared at her for a long time. Then, without another word, he turned, climbed back into his truck, and drove away. Emily didn't move until his taillights disappeared. Then, for the first time in years, she felt free. Daisy's safe haven. Hours later, Joe finally pulled into the small farm where Daisy would be safe. He opened the trailer door, leading the mare out gently. Daisy stepped into fresh grass, her ears flicking forward. She was home. A new beginning. The next morning, Emily packed a bag. She walked through the house one last time, letting the silence settle around her. Then, she grabbed her keys. She wasn't staying here. Not anymore. As she pulled out of the driveway, she didn't look back. Because for the first time in years, she was finally looking forward. 1 year later, the Montana morning air was crisp and clean, the sky stretching endlessly above the rolling fields. Emily breathed it in deeply, standing by the wooden fence of Ben's ranch, watching as the horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. Among them, Daisy stood strong and proud, her golden coat glistening under the sunlight. She was healthy now, whole, free. Emily ran a hand along the wooden fence, feeling the grain beneath her fingertips. It had taken a long time to get here, a long time to feel safe. A new beginning. Emily had left Texas the morning after Richard drove away. She had packed only what she needed, climbed into her truck, and hit the road. There had been no dramatic goodbyes, no second-guessing. She hadn't looked back. She had driven straight to Montana, where Ben had been waiting with open arms and a place for her to stay. The transition had been hard at first. She had spent so many years trapped in a life that wasn't hers that she had forgotten what freedom even felt like. But day by day, she had rebuilt herself. She had found work at a local veterinary clinic, assisting with horses, learning more than she ever thought she would. She had fallen in love with the land, with the quiet peace of the Montana countryside, so different from the life she had known in Texas. And most importantly, she had Daisy, her reason to fight, her reminder that she had made the right choice. Daisy's transformation. It had taken months of care and patience, but Daisy had recovered. Michael had been right. Her joint disease couldn't be cured. But with the right treatment, exercise, and a proper diet. She was stronger than ever. Emily watched now as Daisy trotted toward her, ears forward, eyes bright. She leaned over the fence, reaching out, and Daisy nuzzled her hand, warm and familiar. Emily smiled. She had won. The ghost of Richard Dawson. Emily knew that Richard hadn't come looking for her. Not directly, at least. Ben had heard rumors from old friends in Texas. Richard had gone on a warpath after losing Daisy. He had spent weeks trying to track her down, making calls, looking for anyone who might have helped Emily. But no one talked. Michael had shut him down. Paul had refused to help him. And eventually, Richard had given up. His ranch was struggling. The cattle business had taken a hit, and he had bigger problems to deal with than chasing after a woman who no longer belonged to him. The last thing Emily had heard, Richard had sold Daisy's stall, as if finally accepting she was never coming back. Closure. One afternoon, Emily had written a letter. She had debated sending it for days, but eventually, she had mailed it. One final message to Richard Dawson. It had been short, simple. Richard, I took Daisy because you were going to let her die. I left because I refused to live the way you wanted me to. You once told me I would regret this. You were wrong. I've never been more free. Emily. She never got a reply. She didn't need one. A different future. Emily had built a new life for herself. One that wasn't about survival, but about living. She had found herself again in Montana, in the quiet mornings on the ranch, in the long rides through the open fields, in the way she no longer had to walk on eggshells every time she spoke. And for the first time in years, she was happy. She was free. And she would never, ever go back. A morning unlike any other. The Montana sky was painted in hues of pink and gold, the morning sun stretching over the endless pastures. Emily stood outside the barn, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. The days felt different now, not filled with anxiety, but with purpose. She had built a routine. Early mornings feeding the horses, long days at the veterinary clinic, quiet nights on the porch with Ben, watching the stars. And most of all, she had Daisy. The mare had changed in the past year, her once frail frame now strong, her eyes no longer filled with the dull resignation of an animal waiting to die. Daisy was alive, thriving, just like Emily. A visitor from the past. Emily was adjusting the saddle on one of Ben's horses when she heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Her body tensed instinctively. She hadn't had any unexpected visitors in a long time. Wiping her hands on her jeans, she stepped toward the driveway, her breath catching when she saw Michael's truck pulling up. She hadn't seen him since the day she left Texas. Michael climbed out, dusting off his jacket, his familiar crooked smile appearing as soon as he saw her. "Well, damn," he said, glancing around the property. "You really did it, huh?" Emily laughed softly, shaking her head. "I did." Michael stepped forward, his eyes scanning her face. "You look different." Emily tilted her head. "Different how?" Michael grinned. "Like someone who actually sleeps at night." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yeah, I do." They stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. Then, Michael reached into his truck and pulled out a worn leather bag. "Brought you something." Emily raised an eyebrow as he handed it to her. She unbuckled the flap and peeked inside, her heart clenching when she saw a familiar green notebook. Her old ledger from the ranch. The one where she had written down every expense, every vet bill, every plan for Daisy's recovery. She ran her fingers over the cover, a lump forming in her throat. "You kept this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded. "Figured you might want it. Proof of how far you've come." Emily swallowed hard, then hugged it to her chest. For so long, she had held on to the past, onto Richard's control, onto the fear of leaving. But now, she had let it all go, and she was never looking back. A final ride that evening, Emily saddled up Daisy, leading her toward the open fields. She swung into the saddle, gripping the reins loosely, feeling the familiar rhythm of Daisy's movements beneath her. Together, they rode across the ranch, the wind whipping through Emily's hair, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth. And as she rode, she whispered a promise. "We made it, girl, and I'll never let anyone take this from us again." Daisy's ears flicked back, as if she understood. Emily smiled, because for the first time in her life, she was finally free. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. If you watched until this point, comment, "I watched until here," and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's really exciting.